Have you ever felt this massive undeniable pull towards something, like a calling or an opportunity or some major shift in your life that is just so glaringly obvious you simply cannot ignore it?
Oh, yeah. I think we all have.
Right. But then the very second you feel the actual weight of it, your immediate visceral gut reaction is just, please, anyone but me.
Yes. It is honestly one of the most profoundly human reflexes we have.
Yeah.
I mean, the moment we perceive the true scale of a responsibility, our survival instinct just kicks in. And our brain immediately starts frantically scanning the room for the nearest exit.
Exactly. I think we've all been there. And to put some flesh and blood on this feeling for you, the listener, I want to take you to the year 1718. So we're in a coastal town in Norway.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah. And there is this pastor named Hans Ageid who suddenly senses this overwhelming, burning conviction to take the gospel to Greenland. But for his wife, Gertrude Rask, this isn't just some fun, adventurous calling. It is a terrifying upheaval. I mean, she is 45 years old. She has 4 children, including a 1-year-old baby. And physically, she is actually quite frail.
Right, which means she isn't just looking at a difficult move across the country. I mean, a voyage to an isolated, frozen, fiercely unforgiving 18th century frontier like Greenland. That was viewed by most people at the time as a literal death sentence.
And her family and friends are telling her exactly that. They are begging her to stop him. So Gertrude is, staring at her baby. She's assessing her own physical weakness. She's picturing the ice and the complete isolation. And her internal cry is that exact desperate plea, Lord, send someone else, like literally anyone but me.
It is such a raw, understandable moment. You can really feel her panic.
You really can. But what absolutely blew my mind going through our notes for this deep dive is how perfectly her panic mirrors one of the most famous encounters in all of human history. I mean, Gertrude in Norway is echoing the exact struggle of Moses standing barefoot at the burning bush.
It's a phenomenal parallel.
Yeah.
Because in both cases, you have these ordinary people colliding with an extraordinary calling, and their very first impulse is to negotiate their way out of it.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because Moses is, frankly, the ultimate case study here. Our goal today is to use the text of Exodus chapter 4 as our roadmap to really dissect this universal instinct of reluctance. We want to understand the actual mechanics of why we run from the things we are meant to do.
And the Moses story is the perfect laboratory for this, right? Because his situation is just so extreme. He is standing in front of a bush that is engulfed in flames, but somehow not turning to ash.
Yeah, and he is hearing the audible, booming voice of the Creator. Logically, if the universe speaks to you out of a magical fire, your response should be a pretty snappy, yes, sir.
You would certainly assume that. You'd think the sheer supernatural weight of the moment would override any hesitation. I mean, God gives him a directive that leaves zero room for ambiguity. He says, go back to Egypt, confront Pharaoh, lead my people out of slavery.
Right. And initially, Moses responds the way, any logical person would. He asks for a logistical clarification. He asks things like, who am I to do this? And what if they ask for your name?
Exactly. Or what if they simply don't believe I saw you? And those are practical inquiries from a man is just trying to wrap his head around a completely impossible assignment.
But then the dynamic shifts dramatically. He runs out of logistical questions, and the excuses start getting intensely personal. We hit Exodus 4.10, and Moses pivots from, how will this work, to, I am physically incapable of making this work.
Yeah, it's a huge shift in tone.
He tells God, I am not eloquent. I am slow of speech and of tongue. He is essentially diagnosing himself with a severe speech impediment right there on the spot.
Yeah.
And he's using it as a medical disqualification from being God's spokesperson.
Which, on the surface, sounds entirely rational. I mean, God is asking a shepherd to march into the court of the most powerful and ruthless monarch on the planet and basically demand the liberation of his entire unpaid labor force.
Yeah, that's intimidating for anybody.
Right, so if you feel like you can't even string a compelling, articulate sentence together, that assignment isn't just daunting. It feels suicidal. But if we dig into the wider historical context here, we discover that this isn't a physical limitation at all.
Yes. This was the moment I actually sat back in my chair while I was prepping for this. Because, you look over at the New Testament in the book of Acts, chapter 7, the early church leader Stephen is giving this massive, sweeping historical speech about Israel.
Right before he's martyred.
Exactly. And he specifically describes Moses during his younger years in Egypt. Stephen states clearly that Moses was, quote, mighty in his words and deeds. Mighty in his words. So he wasn't naturally inarticulate at all.
The historical record flat out contradicts his excuse at the burning bush. I mean, Moses possessed a royal Egyptian education. He
Yeah.
definitely knew how to communicate with authority.
Which means his plea isn't about inability, it's entirely about insecurity. I was like trying to figure out the psychology of how a guy who is mighty in words suddenly claims he can't speak. And it made me think of the corporate world.
Oh, how so?
Well, imagine a brilliant rising star executive at a massive global company. They are just crushing it, delivering incredible keynotes, making bold moves, but then a colossal scandal hits. They are publicly humiliated, ousted from the industry, and they spend the next 40 years living in absolute obscurity, working as a barista in a tiny, forgotten town.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Right. So if you walk into that coffee shop 4 decades later and say, hey, we need you to go back and be the CEO right now, they are going to pull out their old resume. Their brain has completely rewired itself. They spent 40 years believing they're just a barista.
What's fascinating here is how perfectly that captures the erosion of human competence. Because Moses didn't just spend a weekend away from Egypt. She spent 40 years tending someone else's sheep in the remote desert of Midian.
40 years of complete isolation.
Exactly. And that kind of prolonged obscurity, it fundamentally rewires your self-image. The ambitious, articulate prince of Egypt has completely atrophied into a forgotten shepherd. He is experiencing the ultimate debilitating form of imposter syndrome.
Yeah, he is projecting his own eroded self-worth onto the situation. He's looking at the burning bush, but he's filtering the voice of God entirely through his own perceived smallness.
And that is the crucial mechanism of reluctance. When we feel overwhelmed, we take the vastness of the calling and we aggressively shrink it down to fit the narrow, comfortable confines of our current self-esteem.
Wow. We shrink the calling to fit our self-esteem. That's powerful.
Yeah. And the 16th century theologian John Calvin made a brilliant observation about this exact passage. He noted that when we obsess over our own flaws in the face of a calling, we are often masking a much deeper rebellion.
Masking rebellion. What do you mean?
Well, Calvin argued that we don't want to admit that we lack trust in the caller, so we eagerly point the finger at our own inadequacies instead. When Moses says, "I am slow of speech," the psychological subtext is actually, God, you have made a massive miscalculation. You literally have the wrong guy.
Which is an incredibly arrogant thing to imply to the architect of reality. You're standing before a literal miracle, basically saying, hey, let's review my resume because clearly you didn't read it.
Right, it's pretty audacious when you put it like that.
So the question is, how does God cure that level of panic? Because modern culture has a very specific playbook for this. If someone is paralyzed by imposter syndrome, we pump them full of self-affirmation. We tell them, you are enough, you have a voice, believe in your own inner power. God doesn't do that at all.
Not even slightly. God flatly ignores modern psychology. He doesn't offer a pep talk, he doesn't polish Moses' ego, and he doesn't pull up that old royal resume to remind Moses of his Egyptian education.
Wait, so God doesn't give Moses a pep talk? Like, at all? He doesn't try to boost his self-esteem even a little bit?
No, instead, he delivers a profound theological shock to the system. God answers the excuse by asking, who makes a person mute, or deaf, or seeing, or blind? Is it not I, the Lord?
Okay, I have to push back here, though. From a philosophical standpoint, reminding someone that you're the creator of the universe sounds very majestic, but practically speaking...
You're saying it doesn't help in the moment.
Exactly. If I am legitimately terrified of public speaking, or if I have a literal physical stutter, giving me a theological trivia lesson about who designed vocal cords doesn't lower my heart rate, how is that supposed to cure his panic right then and there?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, God isn't giving him trivia. He is shifting the entire burden of outcome. Think about how we view limitations. We view a lack of eloquence or a physical frailty or a past failure as a bug in the system, like something that disqualifies us from being useful.
Right, we see it as a broken part.
God is aggressively reframing that by saying, I am the one who makes a mouth. He's telling Moses that if a limitation exists, it is a feature of the plan, not a bug. God is sovereign over the weakness just as much as he is sovereign over the strength.
Oh, wow. That completely flips the script. If the limitation is by design, then the success of the mission cannot possibly rely on Moses suddenly becoming a masterful orator.
Precisely. God is removing the spotlight from human capability and locking it onto divine sovereignty. The Apostle Paul talks about this exact mechanism centuries later when he writes that God's power is actually perfected in human weakness.
Perfected in weakness.
Yeah, because why? Because if God uses someone incredibly polished and capable, onlookers might just chalk the victory up to human talent. But if God uses a stuttering, hesitant 80-year-old shepherd to break the greatest empire on earth, there is zero confusion about who actually accomplished the deliverance.
The oneness isn't the barrier, the weakness is the stage. That is so good. The limitation is the exact environment required for the power to be visible. And that makes total sense of God's actual promise in the very next verse. Because God doesn't say, I will instantly heal your insecurity or I will make you the greatest speaker in history. Verse 12 just says, I will be with your mouth.
It is the ultimate covenant promise of divine presence. We see this mechanism constantly throughout historical texts.
Yeah, like where else?
Well, when the young prophet Jeremiah panics and says, I'm only a youth, I don't know how to speak, God's antidote isn't, you're actually very mature for your age. The antidote is, I am with you. Or when Jesus sends his terrified followers out to evangelize the hostile Roman Empire, he doesn't say, you guys are highly trained debaters. He says, I am with you always.
So the biblical solution to human inadequacy is never to generate more self-reliance. The solution is always the presence of the God who equips.
Exactly. The authority is transferred from the instrument to the operator.
I love that. It's like if a master violinist picks up a cheap, scratched garage sale violin, the audience isn't captivated by the wood. They are captivated by the master's hands. God is basically saying, I'm going to play the music. You just have to let me hold the instrument.
That is a beautiful way to understand it. And, at that point in the narrative, the argument should be definitively over. Moses has received the ultimate assurance.
Right. God has completely dismantled the logic of the excuse. He's promised his personal presence. He's guaranteed the success of the mission. It is an absolute, complete checkmate. And yet, Moses digs his heels in even further.
He really does.
In verse 13, all the polite, pseudo-humble excuses just evaporate. He drops the act and blurts out the raw, unvarnished truth. He says, please, Lord, send someone else.
It is a breathtaking moment of stubbornness. After all that reassurance, the core issue is finally exposed on the table.
Yeah.
It was never about his speech. It was never about his ability. It was entirely about his willingness to surrender control.
And the text says God's anger is kindled, which frankly makes sense. I mean, Moses is essentially calling God a liar to his face.
Yeah.
But this is the part of the narrative that genuinely caught me off guard when we were researching this.
The fact that God doesn't cancel the mission.
Yes, God gets angry, but he doesn't abandon the project. He doesn't smite Moses and say, fine, stay with your sheep. I'll go find Joshua right now. Instead, God accommodates the panic. He tells Moses that his brother, Aaron, is already on the way, and Aaron will act as the mouthpiece.
It's an incredible display of grace.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because my initial reaction to reading that was, wait, why is this a bad thing? In the modern professional world, if you are a great strategist but a terrible public speaker, you get co-founder, you get a hype man, you divide the labor.
We definitely celebrate teamwork today.
Right. Isn't community and having a teammate a huge win? Why do the theological sources frame the arrival of Aaron as a negative consequence?
It is a vital question, because you're right. Scripture heavily champions community. The Apostle Paul traveled with Barnabas. Jesus sent his disciples out in pairs. Partnership is a profound grace. But we have to look closely at the actual mechanism of what is happening here with Moses.
Okay, so what's the difference?
Well, Aaron is a provision, yes, but ultimately he is a concession.
Meaning, this was definitively Plan B.
Exactly. The 4th century philosopher and theologian Augustine had a brilliant insight into this dynamic. Augustine pointed out that God operates with a kind of permissive will.
Permissive will. Okay.
Because God is incredibly patient with our frailties, he will sometimes grant us what we stubbornly insist upon, even though it is far less than his optimal plan for us. God had already promised, I will be with your mouth. Moses didn't need a backup speaker. He needed to step into the terrifying void of relying entirely on God.
So by demanding a safety net, Moses fundamentally altered his own trajectory. Think about it like going to the gym. Moses asking for Aaron to do the speaking is like hiring a personal trainer, but then asking the trainer to lift the weights for you.
Yeah, exactly.
You get the immediate relief of avoiding the heavy lifting, and the weights technically get moved, but you permanently forfeit the muscle growth you would have gained by straining under the bar yourself.
That analogy perfectly isolates the cost of the concession. God is gentle enough to accommodate the weakness, and the Israelites will still be delivered. But by hedging his bets, by demanding that Aaron act as a buffer between him and Pharaoh Moses, is delaying his own spiritual development.
He is choosing to trust in a visible human safety net rather than an invisible divine promise.
And delayed trust always results in a diminished experience of God's power.
We do the exact same thing today. I mean, we feel convicted to take a risk. Maybe it's having a really difficult moral conversation, or making a radical career shift for a good cause, or standing up against an injustice. And instead of just doing the terrifying thing, we scramble for a buffer.
Oh, constantly.
We form a committee. We wait for someone else to speak first. We want the absolute guarantee of safety before we move an inch.
We constantly demand that God leave the training wheels on the bike. And sometimes, in his mercy, he does. I mean, Aaron is a monument to God's incredible patience, but he is also a permanent historical reminder of Moses' faltering faith.
But here's what I can't square with all of this. We have just spent the last 20 minutes dissecting how Moses stalled, complained, projected his insecurities, and practically forced God to give him a backup plan just to get about the door.
Right, not a great look.
Not at all. Yet when you zoom out to the broader biblical narrative, how is he remembered? We look at Deuteronomy 34:9, and it says, "There has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face."
The greatest prophet in Israel.
Exactly. How does a guy who literally begs for the exit become the absolute gold standard of faithfulness?
It's an incredible paradox, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But it reveals the core mechanism of how God shapes human character. Moses' life proves that a weak, deeply hesitant beginning does not permanently disqualify you from a faithful finish.
That is reassuring.
Yeah, God is not scouring the earth looking for prepackaged, perfect people who never harbor a single doubt. He is actively in the business of forming faithful people over long periods of time. Moses is not defined by his panic attack in Exodus 4. He is defined by the God who stubbornly stayed with him, relentlessly molded him, and worked through him for the remaining 40 years of his life.
Which is deeply comforting. It means our initial failure of courage doesn't have to be the final word on our identity. But, it also leaves me with a pretty heavy thought. Because if I'm completely honest, I hesitate way more often than Moses did.
I think we all do.
I run from responsibility constantly. So if Moses is the benchmark of human faithfulness, and even he failed the initial test this badly, where does our ultimate hope actually lie?
This raises an important question, and it is where the theological analysis of these sources truly reaches its peak. Because the biblical text doesn't leave Moses as the final answer. To understand the resolution, we have to look at a first-century Christian text, specifically the book of Hebrews.
Okay, let's go there.
In chapter 3, the writer of Hebrews is addressing an audience of people who are exhausted, persecuted, and desperately wanting to quit. And the writer draws a direct structural comparison between Moses and Jesus Christ.
They set them up side by side to really highlight the contrast.
Precisely. The writer acknowledges that Moses was a great and faithful servant in God's house, but Jesus is the builder of the house itself. Where Moses is the flawed prototype, Jesus is the perfect fulfillment. Think about the burning bush again. God outlines a mission of deliverance, and Moses immediately tries to find a loophole.
He stalls, he offers excuses, he pleads, send someone else.
Right. Now contrast that with Christ. When the Father outlines the ultimate mission of deliverance, a mission that doesn't just involve confronting a human Pharaoh, but facing the cross, absorbing the wrath of God, and conquering death itself, Jesus doesn't look for an exit.
He doesn't ask for a plan B.
No, he resolutely sets his face toward Jerusalem. Where Moses said, "Anyone but me," Jesus stepped out of eternity and said, "Here I am, send me."
Here I am. It is the exact symmetrical opposite of Moses' response.
And that perfect obedience fundamentally changes the mechanism of our hope. If our standing with God depended on our ability to muster up enough internal courage to never hesitate, we would all be crushed under the weight of our own failures.
Oh, 100%.
But our hope isn't secured by our bravery. It is entirely secured by Christ's perfect record. He acted as our representative. Because Jesus didn't shrink back, because he fully obeyed the Father in every single moment, his obedience covers our reluctance. The pressure is definitively off. We are forgiven for the times we have run away, and we are infused with his Spirit to finally step forward.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this deep dive right now? It completely reframes the pressure of living a purposeful life. You don't have to wait until you are perfectly eloquent or totally fearless or completely free of imposter syndrome to step into what you are called to do.
No, you really don't.
You are stepping forward simply because the one who perfectly obeyed the call is now actively walking with you. We started today by looking at Gertrude Rask, terrified of the ice of Greenland, and Moses, terrified of the court of Pharaoh. Their instinct to run is our instinct. It is universal.
It's the human condition.
But God's persistence is relentless. He meets us squarely in our insecurity. He redirects our frantic focus away from our own limitations and onto his sovereignty, and he guarantees his presence. He doesn't call us because we are sufficient. He calls us so that his staggering sufficiency can be put on brilliant display right through the cracks of our weakness.
That's the heart of it.
The challenge for you listening right now is to stop letting your past hesitations dictate your future obedience. Whatever that weight is that you feel pulled toward right now, whether it is a massive life change or a quiet, mundane act of daily faithfulness, do not let the fear of inadequacy win. It is time to move from the fearful, anyone but me, to a faithful, here am I.
And as you think about taking that next terrifying step, I will leave you with this final thought to mull over. If God deliberately chooses what we consider weak to display his ultimate power, what if that one deep insecurity you hold, that one specific limitation you've been using for years as your ultimate excuse to stay comfortable, is actually the exact stage God has been setting up to do his most profound work through you?